Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 40K Fireside podcast. I'm David Gaylard, and I'm joined by my good friend Vijay. Together, we discuss 40K and the meta from our perspective, along with events we've recently been to and those that have got coming up. So come on down to the fireside and listen.
Welcome everyone to 40K Fireside episode 2. It's amazing to have you guys back here. If you haven't heard the first episode, it is available on YouTube on the channel or on any of your major podcast providers. In this episode, we are going to follow our same agenda of splitting into 3 parts. And the first part, we're just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping and run through what we've been up to during the week. And then on our second part, we're going to go through the events that we've been to. I've been to Battlefield Birmingham, which is a GT, and Dave's been to an invitational GT. And then in the final part, which is probably the main part of this episode, we're going to go through everything to do with Leagues of Votann. The whole codex is leaked. We've managed to get a few test games in, and we've both been building some lists and trying to think about how it will sit in the meta. And then we're going to answer a couple of listener questions that we've got in, and Dave's also going to do a few more thoughts about Chaos Demons because he's had a little bit more time to think about that. I'm going to hand you over to Dave, who's going to run you through the first part.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks everyone for coming back. If you haven't checked out the previous episode and you're new to listening to this, I would highly suggest going and having a listen. We talk about all things from Tyranids to the current meta, and it's a great recap and introduction to Vic and myself as well. You can find that on most podcast platforms or on YouTube, searching the 40K Fireside podcast. Now on to some housekeeping. Hopefully you'll hear that my microphone sounds slightly better. My microphone audio quality was one of the big pieces of feedback we got from the previous episode, so I'm trying hard to work on that. In terms of the frequency, I think we're hitting roughly about a week and a half now here for the second episode, and this probably feels like a good frequency to do podcasts for us as well. Like Vic mentioned, we're keeping the agenda and format similar in that way, and we'll keep giving you those breaks between our sections as well, the classic jazz music. So, with no delay, let's head on over to part 2 of the podcast. And that concludes part 2. We hope you're enjoying the fireside, and we'll see you momentarily for part 3. Alright everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the 40K Fireside podcast. This is where we're going to be talking about 2 events that Vic and I both played in last weekend. The Battlefield Birmingham GT, which I think was around about 55 players, and the Invitational Unconquerable event that I played in as well on the weekend, which was 24 players in a seeded pod event. So Vic had some great results over the weekend. He was playing Emperor's Children and managed to take a cheeky little 5-0. There were 2 players undefeated, and Vic even bet the second player to get the most battle points for the tiebreaker, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
So Vic, do you want to run us through how the event went? What was your round 1, and what was kind of the flavor of the event?
Yeah, well, it was an event local to me in Birmingham, and for people who didn't hear the last episode, I did go through my list in that and also a lot about the event. But just to roughly run it through, I was bringing the Emperor's Children to this event, which is one of the Chaos Space Marine sub-factions, is the Slanesh one. And I had a really good run. They're a very fun list. I've got in about 20 or so practice games before I brought this list to the event, which is a lot more than what I often get to do before I come to an event. So I was well prepared. I'd made some tweaks to my list to kind of adapt to the terrain setup, which was a little bit more open in the middle of the board. And yeah, I had a great run. It was a lovely run event. This is actually the first time that the TO, so this is the 19th Battlefield Birmingham, but this is the first time the TO has run the event as an ITC event. He called it an ITC event. And his feedback at the end was, oh my gosh, as soon as I put ITC in front of it, the crowd is so much nicer who's attending the event, which is kind of interesting. So my list, just to briefly run through the broad strokes of it, was Chaos Space Marine list, which was placed into a single battalion with a Supreme Command. The Supreme Command had Abaddon in it, and then I had a Demon Prince, Dark Apostle, Master of Possession, 5 units of Noise Marines with a Blastmaster, Power Fist, Chaos Icon, and Chainswords on the remaining members. And then I had a unit of 10 Terminators with a splattering of different weapons, including 4 Combi Melters and a few Reaper autocannons, as well as some Power Fists and a Chain Fist. And then we had a Venom Crawler to round out the list.
All right, Vic. So, run me through? What did you play round one and day one, and kind of what were your thoughts after day one?
So I went in hard. I got paired up into probably the type of list that I least wanted to face. It was a very good Harlequins light list, and that's not an ideal list for me to face because there's a little bit too much for me to chew through. And sometimes the scoring can be a little bit difficult. Chaos Space Marines don't have the best secondaries. But the thing with this terrain setup was all but one of the objectives was you had to be in the open or in a firing lane in order to be on it.
Yep.
So I'd set up all my Blastmasters around the edge of the board with firing lanes to all of the objectives except for my opponent's home objective. And that kind of trapped him a little bit. He didn't have anywhere to go where he wasn't trading his units to my shooting. So what happened was about the middle of the game, he suddenly really started to run out of things. I was sitting on the middle of the board with the Terminators, who I also realized it's impossible for Harlequins to ever kill that Terminator brick. So yeah, he didn't even bother shooting a single bullet.
That's always nice.
Yeah, as soon as the first turn went, I realized he's never going to be able to kill this unit. I switched all of my buffs around to all of my little Noise Marine units, whichever units were further forward. So one unit would get the 5 up, feel no pain. One unit would get the +1 toughness, and one unit would get the can only be hit on 4s by the Dark Apostle, which just really limited the targets that he could deal with efficiently. The score ended up being 95-58 to me, and that was a really positive start to the tournament.
Yeah, it's a great start to round one. It's always kind of the start that you want. It's interesting that you mentioned about the terrain there, and let's touch on that after you wrap up the event. What was serving up for round two?
So still playing deeply into the meta. Round 2 was against the lovely Josh Richards with a Necron list, and this was a very solid player. He had a double Votann list with the Silent King and the usual relentless expansionist combo. And on this one, it was a bit interesting because I've had one game into Necrons before, so I was learning a little bit as I went along with this. And my theory was just run as fast as I can forward at him and just put too much pressure on because the data sheets are a little bit weak on the Necrons. Despite the fact that they have so much OBSEC, incredible secondaries, they can fall apart very quickly if you target them. So I went right up into the middle of the board. He used his destroyers to try and pick up some Noise Marine units down the side with his teleport. He managed to take out a good chunk of my army with that teleport, but then essentially the game ended up being he just had 2 Votann left and the Silent King, and everything else died. And I think this happened as early as turn 3. And at that point, he was in the middle of the board. He went in, he killed 8 out of 10 Terminators just with those 3 characters. So you got to be careful.
Yeah.
It was a bit scary.
That's a lot of output.
But then my whole army was still sitting behind that, so ended up just picking up the Votann, and then we called it there. So
you had the Abaddon to follow up after the Silent King had gone, and I take it too, right?
Yeah, that's it. I'm not even sure Abaddon actually got into combat in this one. But I had the little relic pistol on the Dark Apostle, which very easily does 4 mortal wounds. Any 6s to hit is 2 mortal wounds on it. It's 4 shots from turn 2 onwards. And yeah, so it was very easy for me to go through the Votann, both of the Votann in one turn between smites and that relic pistol and a lot of combat.
Yeah, you've got a nice multi-phase army there as well, which is really good at dealing with Votanns. I think that's kind of the core weakness to Votanns that has left people moving away from them as well, and just having more thickness on the board for the Necron list. What was your round 3? This is the closing round of the day. So how did you close it out?
Yep, so I'm still playing deeply in the top of the meta and playing against a Leviathan list. Now, this was a Leviathan Nid list, so this was an absolutely gorgeous, completely converted army. If you imagine Squats and GSC had a baby, that was what this Nid army looked like. So everything was a robot. I had to ask him about 10 times which one was his Hive Tyrant. But it was an amazing army, really, really nice opponent. And we essentially set up on the line to each other. I was tucked in behind cover. He had a fair bit of shooting with a bunch of venom cannons, and I sat in cover, took the shooting, and then I shot him back. What happened was that I was a little bit heavily weighted to one flank, which I don't think he'd fully accounted for. Um, and then I ended up sweeping a flank, and then at that point, he was about to lose his whole army. So, last game of the day, he conceded. I think it was about the first half of turn 3 when he conceded. And that was a decent win for me, 87-43.
There you go. So you've effectively tabled all your opponents day one by the turn 3 and 4. I'm just going to put it out there. This army's got some serious output, man.
Yeah, people are sleeping on this. This is, I think, if you play it carefully and you make sure you keep all your pieces in cover, use defensive buffs as effectively as possible, you do win the shooting and the combat war if someone stands off against you, against most armies in the meta at the moment. So as long as you don't make an overcommitment with the noise marines, because they do die very quickly, you can find on turn 3 you suddenly have so much of your army still alive, putting out very intense firepower.
Yep. And you've got kind of you've still got the blastmasters left in the squads. Like, you might have lost 2 or 3 from each unit, but you've still got the blasties, which are a massive part of the output.
Exactly.
So you might have lost 400 points, but it might not be in any core unit that's going to affect your total output. Nice. So the pairings come out overnight, of course, like they always do, and you've got our teammate George with his really nice Freebait Knights list. How did that go, and what were you expecting going into it?
So George is an amazing player. He plays Imperial Knights, and he's got that free blade list where you can give multiple knights a 4-up invuln and -1 damage. I personally, and I think we all think in the team, and most of the people in England now, that's become the optimal way of playing Imperial Knights rather than the Tyrannus version of the list. He had 1 big knight and 10 baby knights, and his list is incredibly strong. I had tested it once, this matchup against you, Dave,
Yep.
on Tabletop Simulator, and I knew going into it that I do have a significant output advantage here. The knights can't kill me very well in shooting, but I can really kill them. The blastmasters do work, albeit it's a little bit swingy, especially if I go second and the knights can get some of their buffs up. The front knights, usually the only ones I can target, will probably have the -1 damage and the 4-up invuln on them. So there's a chance I could whiff and have a very slow turn, which could be terminal on the points. That was my takeaway for this. George, on the other hand, had no experience into this matchup, and George is very confident, and he was talking some banter to me, and a little bit of smack,
healthy bit of smack talk. I like that.
You know, I think the quote is, "If I go first, oh yeah, I can't lose to anything."
Classic.
So obviously we roll off for first turn. George gets first turn, so he gets first turn, puts all his buffs up, moves forward into the middle of the board, does all his secondaries, and suddenly he's got like 1 million secondary points. I don't even know what's happening. He's telling me, yeah, I got 5 on this, 4 on that, 4 on that, whatever. Fine, George, you've got all the points. And then I lined up all the blastmasters and just started shooting away. And then my Terminators also, I use the Master of Possession, can stab one of your Terminators to do D3 mortal wounds and get +2 to cast on a spell on any of his table of spells, so not Smite or Delightful Agonies or anything like that. I cast 2 of his spells, killed one of my Terminators, healed the Terminator back, and put it 3 inches closer, made a charge into 2 of his little knights. Oof. When the dust cleared after everything, he'd lost 5 knights.
5? I thought you were going to say 4, but 5.
I'm pretty sure it was 5. No, end of battle round 1, yeah, he'd lost 5 when the last one died in his turn, the one that was stuck in combat.
I see, yeah.
So that was pretty rough.
And you can't come back. You obviously can't come back from losing 5
my Terminators were in his deployment zone, so
right.
It was a bit of a rough one. And then George had his turn. He charged everything he had into the Terminators. Terminators were fully defensively buffed here. I was able to get the charge without having to use the advance and charge. And he killed, I think, 2 Terminators out of the 10 with all of his combat. So, and that was it. He didn't kill anything else. So That was a
That sounds like a bit of a fast game, that one.
yeah, that was a really quick game,
Yeah.
and it was very obvious what was going to happen. Abaddon was in charge range as well on one flank, and the Terminators were on another flank in his deployment zone, and I still had 5 Blastmasters to shoot. So
Yeah, brutal.
a
What
little
was
bit rough.
so you've just dispatched our teammate playing Imperial
Yeah.
Knights. What are we looking at for the final round of the tournament?
So final round, back to the worst matchup. This is Chris Radford, who's actually a local player to me, and I play a lot of practice games with him. He's an extremely competent player, and I think you've played him before, haven't you, Dave?
Probably, but as we all
Yeah.
know, I'm terrible with names.
So Chris is one of those players where, you know, you'll probably see him at a lot of events, but he's not like one of those named players, like
Mm,
ones that everyone knows the name of, but he's definitely good enough to be that.
mm,
And he's got a Harlequins army, a light army. Again, I think it's 8 Star Weavers, and then just lots and lots of troops, and a couple of little Skyweaver bikes, along
mhm,
with 2 Shadowseers and a Troopmaster, and a Solitaire as well. No Death Jester in this one. Um, I had got a practice game in with Chris on the Friday before the event, so that was useful.
nice little bit of
And
info there.
yep, and in that practice game, it 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 was the first time he'd played it, so he'd made a couple of mistakes. It was the first time I'd played that matchup, and I also didn't do it optimally. So we were both going into this having some ideas on what
Mm,
we can do to improve. Now, Chris went in with the plan that he was going to not bother with doing damage. He's going to try and beat me on the scoreboard.
mhm,
And he did everything just throwing away units just to get points and not setting up in any way to actually whittle down my units. And I think it was a good idea to try a different approach
mm,
because, like like we saw with the first game against the other Harlequin player, if I have those angles to shoot, the Harlequin army can lose too much of its army quickly. So Chris stayed really far back, completely hidden in his deployment zone, and only put units out to get points. The problem was in the middle of the game when I had reached the middle of the board with my whole army. And essentially, it was like I had started turn one on the middle of the board.
mm,
So I had an immediate, not even an approach turn. I was just on the middle of the board. My next turn, I'm going into his deployment zone with everything.
yep.
Um, so I was ahead on the primary by a big chunk. My secondaries were rubbish, which I'm used to. But turn four, I'm absolutely rinsing his army.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's pretty much tabled by the end of the game. And we called it there on a 97-61,
Yep.
which put me about 40 points ahead of the other undefeated player, I think, on battle
Smashed it.
points. So yeah, it was quite amazing because I haven't lost a game with Emperor's Children, just to note, with any of the practice games.
Mhm,
But even then, in my head, I've got that this isn't a top army.
mm,
There's too many fundamental weaknesses in the army for it to be a good army.
mhm.
But this event kind of showed me that it does have the strengths to play very well in events against a wide range of armies. I basically played the whole of the top of the meta here.
Yep.
So yeah, I think Emperor's Children, you know, maybe they're not outright as powerful as Creations of Bile, but I think if you play it correctly, they have all the tools to be one of the best armies in the game.
Yeah, for sure. And like I think we talked about previously, is that it's such a well-rounded army. You've got so many options there at your disposal, and if you're a really competent, skillful player, you can use that to leverage more of the player skill gap as well. Whereas I think Creations of Bile is potentially a little bit more one-dimensional. So you basically played the whole merry-go-round of meta armies, and it didn't sound like you had any trouble whatsoever. So what was in terms of that, is there anything that you would change about the list if you were going to say submit it on UKTC terrain? What would you be like? Was there anything? What was the MVP unit and what was or data sheet and what was the thing that you were not so much impressed with?
So I think the MVP unit was the Terminators in this event. They were phenomenal all the way through this. It
Really?
was
Well, I'm going to stop you there. Why? I mean, you're going to tell me why, but when I think of the Terminators, I just think of them as so slow and clunky. But how are you managing to activate them so well?
So Emperor's Children, the Dark Apostle allows them to advance and charge. There's a 1 CP strat after you advance, you count as remaining stationary, so you can shoot. And then Emperor's Children have an auto 6 advance for 1 CP. They have an auto, one of the dice becomes a 6 on the charge for 1 CP. So you can realistically threaten 18 inches out of the middle of the board on a roll of a 1 on your second dice on the charge. So on average, it's more like 20 inches of threat. On a unit that is almost unkillable, being able to have that threat range from the middle of the board means that as soon as you get in the middle, the next turn will be in your opponent's deployment zone, unless they're very far back. And then the Blastmasters can still shoot at range and find angles. So it's kind of a little bit of a catch-22. They can't ignore the Terminators and Emperor's Children because they're much faster than any other Legion. And I just found them incredible.
Yes.
They were just the linchpin of the whole list.
So you kind of just use them to absolutely bully your opponent, and kind of the same with Tyranid Warriors, is that if they try to sink the damage into them and they don't have the right profiles to pick them up, they just end up trading so badly into them, and then the rest of your army is ready to activate in the next turn as well, right?
Absolutely. And especially with the heal, I found that anyone who did try and commit to the Terminators were usually killing 2 or 3 with the units that were able to see them. And then being able to get another 3 inches of movement by bringing a model back, on top of actually gaining another Terminator who can shoot and punch, is such a big swing. They were amazing.
Really powerful. What was the unit that didn't really impress you so much?
So actually the army was really well made for this event. There was nothing in there that was really bad. I put in a unit of cultists, actually. I forgot to mention that in my list breakdown. There was one unit of cultists, and I loved that unit of cultists. Being able to raise a banner on your home objective without any stress and allowing your Dark Apostle to raise the second banner if there is an objective near your home deployment zone felt really, really strong. I like that balance between the two.
Yeah.
But what didn't perform? I don't know, man. I think
It was all
I
pretty
would've
well balanced. It sounds like
Yeah.
everything is just really strong by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was summoning in a Herald of Slanesh with a spare 55 points,
That's
which
right, yeah.
that opened up the Demon Prince to be very good in a way that he hasn't been good in any of my practice games where I
So
haven't been
I don't
summoning a
know.
Herald.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what that does, but what does summoning the Herald of Slanesh do?
So the Herald of Slanesh gives me another caster. So
Ah.
she can either smite or, more importantly, every single game I took Warp Ritual or Psychic Interrogation. So that just opens up the Demon Prince to not have to be in the middle or set up for a Psychic Interrogation. And the Demon Prince in this setup, I had him with full rerolls to hit and wound. So he was actually quite a beat stick character. And you can put advance and charge on him, and he can move out and like clear an area. That's something I'm not going to have access to anymore. And if I want to play the Psychic Secondaries, I don't have HQ slots to be able to allow the Demon Prince do that role, which is going to suck a little bit, to be honest. I think this list felt really strong because the Demon Prince was open to be played with.
Yeah, it's a little bit limiting when you have to commit a character that has so much potential to doing secondaries, I've found as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if you were going to play on UKTC, any changes? I know you talked previously on the episode 1 around mixing in Possessed. Would we change any points at all?
I think I would probably, I'd pivot one unit of Noise Marines to a unit of Possessed. I wouldn't run more than a single unit of Possessed, but the one unit of Possessed is very good on UKTC terrain. And then I have a bunch of spare points. I would take all of the guns off of my Terminator so they just all have combi bolters. And then I would, that's it. So that's and then maybe a couple of units of Noise Marines don't need their Power Fist. I can probably save 10 points on that on the units that end up staying further back or holding objectives.
Yep.
And that probably gives me enough points for another Venom Crawler, so I can have 2 Venom Crawlers.
Ooh,
Venom Crawlers
spicy.
are amazing.
I did say that in the previous episode too. I said getting that.
Yeah, they're so good on UKTC as well, because that 12-inch move with a 36-inch range gun is just ideal on UKTC for finding angles.
Yep, and they're cheap enough and durable enough to where if your opponent wants to commit to them, you're not hugely bothered by it as well. They're not a linchpin part of your army as well.
Yeah,
Nice.
absolutely. So that's my Battlefield Birmingham experience, and I think maybe now's a good time to move on to your event for the weekend, Dave. You went to the Unconquerable GT, which was made up of players who'd gone 5-0 at the Super Majors over the past year in the UK. to talk us through? How was your experience?
Yeah, so going into this, I think I approached it, and a lot of people approached this tournament more as a in-house practice or semi-boot camp. I know I certainly did approach it that way to the LGT. So it was a good opportunity to get 5-6 rounds in against opponents that you're probably going to meet in the 4-0, 5-0 bracket. And that's quite rare to get that amount of practice in one weekend. On top of that, it wasn't worth any ITC points or anything like that. So there wasn't necessarily a direct reason to bring your top lists, especially because you'd be potentially showing what you're playing at LGT. So that was kind of the backdrop or the context going into it. Round one, so list-wise, I was playing Tyranids, Leviathan Warriors. This time I was trying out the Tyranid Prime, so I wanted to have a little bit more shooting and see how that worked out.
Nice.
But round one, I get paired into a guy named George playing Dark Elder, and this is actually the first loss of the tournament for me. So I'm losing round one, which it's not a great start. Something I'm not used to. He managed to bomb a significant part of my army with the Void Raven bombers, and picked up my Neurothrope with just one, which is just, I mean, mathematically that's quite unlucky. And then the second one, he also put my other Neurothrope to one. I think he might have dealt around about 24 or 25 mortals with the Void Raven bombers. So that was a little bit of the rough start. Admittedly, I think I played a little bit sloppy as well. This is definitely a game that I look back on and think, if I just played tight or played my 3 objectives and didn't try and just table them across the board, I would have been in such a better position. And arrogantly, I kind of went and tried to go for the table approach, which didn't work out well. I got very unlucky not wiping a squad, so I couldn't overrun out. Kind of classic. But I figured maybe 5 warriors would pick up 4 incubi, but apparently it's not the case.
Yeah, sometimes these things do get a bit swingy. Those Void Raven bombers doing D6 mortal wounds in a 6-inch aura around any point they fly over can really be swingy.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you felt there were a couple of things where you were maybe a little bit sloppy. What kind of movement or tactical mistakes are those particularly?
Yeah, and this is quite unusual for me because this is actually one of my strengths, particularly, is that damage allocation, output allocation, I'm usually quite good with. But what I'd done is I'd put my warriors on both. We're playing Dawn of War, by the way. I'd put both my warriors on both flanks. Instead of, I should have just committed to one flank, so I could have 100% killed one of the Void Raven bombers. Unfortunately, I kind of split shot a little bit too much and then just ended up not really killing anything really that significant. And that was a big error for me. Whilst also, if I just put my 2 warrior bricks side by side, that would have let me play the middle objective and the objective on the middle right. So I would have been able to hold 3 out of 5, and he would have had to walk his castle and characters, not really a castle, but his deadly characters and like incubi and whatnot like that across the midboard for a turn, and that would have allowed me to map it up better. So just a strategic error there. And I think that, it's just, at the end of the day, I think some people don't maybe appreciate that players like you and myself, Vic, we're human beings and we do make mistakes at the end of the day, and that's part of what makes 40K such a great game as well, is that it's not a game of direct chess per se. It's there's definitely room for error and cognition errors and stuff like that, and they just happen even around one of a tournament when you're fresh.
Absolutely, yeah. So you've taken a loss on the first game, and well done to George for winning that. Moving on to your next game, what were you paired up against?
So I had your cousin. I had Creations of Bile playing against Ewan, who's a lovely guy, and we've met previously in a tournament where I think he may have been playing Custodes, but correct me if I'm wrong there, Ewan. And yeah, lovely guy. So this was another really great game because I'd played against Vic's Emperor's Children a couple of times, and Creations of Bile, as I understood them, were completely melee orientated, and they have a little bit of a beta secondary, which kind of is the reason why they're a bit more popular.
Mm-hmm.
So I get first turn, I move a bit of my warriors. My impression was going into the game is that completely melee orientated, I'm going to put my warriors right on the far sides of the table so that I can advance and shoot if I go first into deep sort of like cutting lines with my venom cannons. That happens, I whiff a little bit, and then I've actually underestimated the threat range of one of his, off the top of my head, I believe it's called a Chosen unit.
Yep.
And that allows him to get a pretty nice charge with actually 2 units into my buffed up warrior brick on his turn 1. And at this point, I've kind of gone, look, David, you've made a bit of an error. You've allowed the Creations army just to charge you, and you should have just been playing at range the whole time. And I very quickly changed my game plan up to only remove his models via smite or shooting, or multi-base the unit that I'm charging with multiple models, so that when he fights on death, he can't fight into my critical unit. So what that allowed me to do is kind of circumnavigate his whole fight on death army. And Tyranids, we've got great psychic output, and I've actually taken the more shooting orientated list that I've ever taken. So I've got the group of 9 warriors, which I put High Fleet Nexus on, so I could get exploding 6s to hit with ranged weapons within 24 inches. So they're hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, and he's got squads that are larger than 6. So the venom cannons are getting max shots. So you get 9 shots, strength 8, -3 damage 2, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, exploding 6s, wounding on, in this case, 3s, because I was double the strength. If I'm correct, I get -1 to wound if I'm double the strength versus toughness. So I'm wounding on 3s, rerolling 1s, which means that oftentimes I'm converting 9 saves with my venom cannons, which was absolutely fantastic. And then, after that, I used the Neurothrope to base one side of his unit so that I can multi-charge with another one. And coming around turn 3 or 4, Ewan kind of said, look, if I just sit back, I'll get more points, but there's no way I'm going to be able to win just because you'll be able to sit your 5 obsec Neurothrope on the middle objective, and I won't be able to move across the board and charge it. So he went for a big Hail Mary. I think he made a 9 or 10 inch charge, but only half his unit could activate to actually get in. And then I ended up cleaning that one up after that as well. So, it was really interesting. Christians of Baal are definitely a solid army. However, they do struggle against the armies that have a good shooting capability alongside a good mortal wound capability, which was what I really felt hit the army really hard. And then a couple of smart decisions around just understanding the army does entirely fight on death, so how can I circumnavigate that with maybe a tankier unit that doesn't really matter so much, and have my harder hitting units basing different sides of the models in the unit just to make sure that he can't hit the whole unit into the one that I don't want. So I think that game was it was really good, man. I had such a blast playing into Christians of Baal, though. It was a good matchup.
That's awesome. And I think that's a really useful tip, what you've just said about fight on death, because a lot of armies have it. Repentia, Emperor's Children have a 2 CP strat for it. The new leagues of Votann, their Berserkers fight on death anyway. And being able to circumvent that by basing models is an extremely strong tactic. So guys, try and put that on the board and see if you can replicate that one if it doesn't quite make sense. But essentially, if an enemy unit model can't reach you with their pile-in move, they won't be able to fight you on death. So brilliant. Moving on to your game 3, Dave, and this is the last game of the pod, is that right?
Yeah, this is the last game of the pod. So game 3, I'm playing against an Aldari player, and sorry, I forgot his name. Like I said, I'm terrible with names. So he had a little bit of a funky list. He had the Yin Khan, and then he also had 2x3 support platforms. Nice. Unfortunately for him, Tyranids and Harpies in particular just absolutely shred this army. There is almost nothing that he can do. A couple of the reasons why is that my Harpies can shoot with their average 10 shots plus 8, into your toughness 3 wound 1 models, which are just, that's really tough. Warrior bricks are just really nigh unkillable for Aldari melee. And the Incan it's a tricky model, but if you play methodically, you can chat with your opponent just to understand where it's going to bounce to. And if you activate in the right sequence, you can set it up so if it bounces to a position way far out, it's never going to want to be there. So fortunately, this one was a bit of a steamroller for me, actually.
Oh, gosh, that's heartbreaking, because I think the recent Ynnari armies that are coming out, be it with planes or with the 2 units of D cannons, like your opponent, are some of the coolest, most interesting armies that I've seen in a while. And it's one of those armies I really want to try. But of course, flyers getting around, especially because you're running Stranglethorn cannons, which are the higher volume of shots, is absolutely awful. Something which a lot of people don't realize, because Ynnari is a little bit of a niche army, is that you can, like with the fight on death thing and managing that, you can also manage the Yin Khan's positioning, because unlike before, where the Yin Khan was able to come down as near as possible to the position where a model died, it now has to come where the model died. So if it's not able to be placed, it doesn't come down. So, and it can't be within engagement range as well. So keep that in mind, guys. You can really push the Yin Khan back if you are struggling against Ynnari, which is quite a strong army in the meta at the moment.
Yeah, no, definitely great advice. It's the type of model where I think if you get one win against it, you become more confident. And until you get that, you're a bit mystified by it. Certainly that's the approach that I have. And I've lost the Yin Khan actually when Leviathan Nids came out, the previous 8th edition codex, and it was I was kind of like, man, this thing's bouncing everywhere. It's like killing my stuff. What's going on? So yeah, that was good. And then so we move on to what happens now is that the pods. If you win your pod, you go to the top 4, and if you don't, if you're in the middle of the pod, you go to say if you're X and 1, you go to the X and 1 pods that newly get formed. So I was off to play the next round. I've actually forgotten what. Oh no, yeah, okay. Next round. This is day 2. I played against Adam Lane, who I've played against
Adam.
multiple times, and yeah, so he's brought a much better list this time. He's playing actually what I thought was initially I thought it was bad, but it's actually a really good Necron list. It's very similar to, I believe off the top of my head, the Australian WTC Necron list. It was, I believe so. Yeah, it had 3x9 scarabs, 3x5 wraiths. It had a big group of destroyers. It had one of the tomb spiders, I believe it's called, which like apparently hits like a truck in melee. And then it's got the obviously got the Silent King. And yeah, it was great. This, like, for example, and in terms of the context of this tournament, this was kind of exactly what I was looking for. We were playing Tide of Conviction, which is the Dawn of War mission with 4 objectives in the middle. I'm playing against Necrons. This, as I kind of saw it, and as we talked about in episode 1, was one of the lose conditions I thought where my army wasn't favored. So a multiple hold objective mission on Dawn of War against Necrons, and I thought this is probably the matchup where I'm going into it. I'm probably 40% to win. Adam goes first and just plays absolutely brilliantly. A few of the nice tactics he really used were he charged my hive turret on objective with the scarabs, and then he blew one up so that I couldn't activate, and he was out of combat, and he was still on the objective. That was a great tactic. He put a Silent King right in the middle of the board where it could deny a power, but also just meant that I had to just move around it, and it just threatened the mid board a lot. Whilst just shooting, it was just something that I either had to choose to commit to or choose to move around. And then in addition to that, some scarab shenanigans. The wraiths actually were just really good. Like,
Wraiths are good.
They're really good, man. I believe that off the top of my head, they're -1 to hit in combat, wounds 3, but they're damage 2, and they have a 4-up invulnerable save.
Correct.
So I mean, these things, I think they move like 12 to 14 inches. They're really good. Their units, their model size is the only thing that really brings them down. So I ended up losing that game by about 15 points. What I did wrong that game was, this is exactly why you want to play these games for LGT, is that I over prioritized my Neurothrope that had the 5 obsec models. I positioned him so that he could get more psychic damage. But what I should have done is I should have just put him on an objective in the middle so that he couldn't yab me off a objective with just one model. So that was a huge mistake by me. In addition to that, I shot his destroyers with my harpies, and they had the light cover trait. And I think I only killed 1 destroyer with 2 harpies. That was a big mistake. I should have either gone for the tomb spider that was on an objective, or what I should have done is just shot scarabs, because even though they can reanimate, they don't get a save against me, and like the efficiency of the shooting would be way better because he can just revive a destroyer as well. So a huge mistake by me for doing that. And then apart from that, I think maybe what I should have done is I should have bombed his Silent King with both my harpies, flown off the board, or kept them on. That would have, on average, removed both the Minas, and then I could have charged the Silent King with a group of warriors. Now, he could have fought last me, but I would have brought a Silent King down a lot, regardless of that. And so maybe that was the play, because the Silent King was just able to sit there and dominate. Over the weekend, I played very cagey. I wanted to try and rely on the shooting a bit more. And I think it was the wrong play in a lot of ways, because a lot of the ways and the strengths of the army are that you're going to bully your opponent with your Tyranid warriors, and they're going to commit into them, and then you clean up afterwards. Where I let him kind of dictate the pace of the fighting. So, a ton of good lessons learned, and that's exactly the type of game that you want going into LGT. And yeah, it was just, I learned so much that game, and it was just, it was a great opportunity to learn some of those lessons that you don't want to learn in the big tournament. But we'll cover that in part 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam is an absolutely lovely guy, and he's a brilliant player as well. So that's a great one to go into an absolute meta Necrons list. And even if you take a loss, you usually learn more from those than anything else, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a great opportunity as I saw it as well.
Nice.
Then round five, I had Sid Saidu with 13 Armigers. Now, Sid and I have played 2 times prior to this, and 13 Armigers, I'm just going to say it now, is not a list that you really are enthused about playing against, regardless of what you play. It's just, there's something, you got to appreciate some part of it, which is just, I'm just playing 13 Armigers, like, it's so one dimensional. And this was actually the time where I thought, okay, well, I've got the Tyrannid Prime, who has an extra Venom Cannon. This is the matchup I said in episode 1. If I run into Knights, the Synaptic Imperative for exploding hits in range within 24, this is exactly the matchup I wanted for. And yeah, it worked out. I won't bore you guys with the details. Sid went first, pushed into the middle objective, which allowed me to get a multi-charge with my warriors, which was kind of it was a big error on his behalf to play. But in all seriousness, he basically had 5 Helverins with autocannons, 2 Lightning Moraxes, and then 6 of the half melee, half combat ones. And I'm not gonna lie, but on an angular deployment board where he can cut lines and shoot my entire army for basically 3 or 4 turns, that's exactly the type of list that's probably going to beat Tyranids, if you ask me, because they're so mobile. They have massive amounts of damage output, and then so yeah. But because he made just a small blunder of putting too many knights in the middle, I was able to multi-charge them and pick them up and get 4. I want to say 4 knights on turn 1 with my harpies also outflanked. I think I got 3, but both my harpies were on outflank. So I was happy with that. And then from there on, it's knights. It's just it's more or less an attrition matchup. What I was kind of impressed by, though, is those Lightning Moraxes. I think that those are a little bit, maybe they're being undervalued a little bit right now. You might want to consider putting one in your list, perhaps, and using the outflank stratagem for 1 CP for knights to put multiple knights back in the outflank and have them come on effectively on the knight player's turn 2, so you can get angles a lot easier and protect yourself. So we ended up going 3 and 2. I think I came like 7th overall. So, but like I said, it was just such a great opportunity to sort of meet a ton of people that I've been seeing over the tournament scene for ages now, and then get like game qualities where it's at that 4-0, 5-0, 6-0 bracket wins. So yeah, all in all, had a great time.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was a great recap, both of our events. And I think that brings us to the end of part 2. And part 3 is the main part where we're going to be talking about the Leagues of Votann. Catch you there.
And that concludes part 2. We hope you're enjoying the fireside, and we'll see you momentarily for part 3. Just a small disclaimer when we talk about the Ymir strat for the Ion Beam, it only deals up to 4 mortal wounds to the target that you select. Alright, on to part 3. Enjoy.
Alright guys, welcome back to part 3 of the podcast, and we're going to be talking about the meta, and in particular, me and Dave have been doing some reading and some test games on the Leagues of Votann, the squats, which have just been leaked online. So, I mean, maybe we should do our like very high level takes on what we think about it, Dave, and we'll go from there. Where are you at with the Leagues of Votann?
The Leagues of Brokann, yes. This codex seems to have, if I were to explain it to someone who hasn't played in the last month, it seems to have everything that has made the top army of its flavor of the month time very powerful. They've seemed to somehow roll all of those abilities up into one codex. So you look, man, my initial impressions with a lot of people are that this is an extremely strong codex. They have flexible units and flexible stratagems which allow them to become unpunished in the sense that they can react and then fall back and shoot or teleport or shoot into combat or deal mortal wounds and whatnot like that. So yeah, I think this army is really powerful. They even have Armor of Contempt and turn off rerolls to wound, which is just absolutely blisteringly powerful. The only thing is that they have shortish range weapons and they don't move as fast. So those are the only 2 weaknesses as I see them. What were your initial impressions, Vic?
Well, I, as you know, I love if a new codex comes out, I'll make a list with the new codex most of the time if I like the aesthetic of the army. So I'm very used to analyzing new codexes, and there are a number of things I look for with a new codex.
Hmm.
So I had a look through the codex, and I looked first of all for whether the army has any good secondaries,
Mm.
and then had a look and checked if their army had any good melee control. And by that, I mean, do they have heroic interventions, fight last, fight on death? The answer to all questions is yes. And then I checked if they have a good durability in their units. Do they have the ability to create a tanky unit in the middle, or are they playing a skirmishing game? Those are usually the two types that goes. Are they playing like Eldar, or are they playing like Tyranids and Chaos Space Marines?
Hmm.
And then, yeah, the last point is looking for any kind of spike or combo damage, which usually I prefer to come from a ranged source.
Mm.
So that'll be like putting Guide, Doom, Dire Avengers getting Bladestorm and shooting something. And Leagues of Votann, I think that part of their damage is so easily achievable. There's so many combos that you can spread across multiple units to make their damage output absolutely blistering. It's higher damage output than anything else in the game. We had Hail of Doom become extremely strong, which was auto wounding on sixes on shuriken weapons. Leagues of Votann have very easy access to auto wounding on sixes via something called is it judgment tokens? I think
Judgment
it's
tokens, yes. You've been
judgment
judged
tokens,
by the dwarves.
where they basically put a grudge on you and they remain for the whole game. And these tokens rack up to 3 tokens on a unit. They're moderately easy to put on a unit. It's very easy to pick the units that you want to put them on. And when a unit has 2 judgment tokens, you auto wound on 5s with anything in your army in shooting and combat. On 3 tokens, you auto wound on 4s, and on 1 token, you auto wound on 6s. So
Hmm.
that mechanic alone makes the damage output absolutely insane. On
It,
top of that, just being so incredibly efficient with their shooting output is yeah, they're extremely strong.
mm. And if you thought that Hail of Doom was powerful, you need to think back to enriched rounds for Skitarii Vanguard and when Admech dropped. This was a 1 CP stratagem where you had 60 shots from a squad, auto wounding on 4 ups at AP2, AP1, sorry. And this stratagem got nerfed in the very first round of iterations of nerfs for Admech. It got put to an auto wound on 5 up for 2 CP, and no one subsequently used it after that. This is basically an army-wide enriched rounds, and when we talk about this and judgment tokens, which is fundamentally how the army plays through judgment tokens, you can get them in 3 ways. Whenever an opponent's enemy unit performs an action or a psychic action, they get a judgment token. Okay, well in 9th edition you do actions all the time. Okay, great. At the beginning of your turn, you can pick one enemy unit on an objective. It gets a judgment token. Fantastic. Guess what you do in 9th edition? You sit on objectives. Great. And then the last way of doing it is whenever an enemy unit kills your unit, they get a judgment token. Okay, well, guess what you do in 9th edition? You're obviously playing Warhammer. You kill each other, right? So in my experience of playing a couple of games with this, by about turn 3, everything has 1 judgment token at least, which means that your whole army is bar none Hail of Doom. And that's all well and good, but there's also a warlord that can, at the start of your command phase, if he can see a unit, he can add a judgment token. Or there's also a warlord trait where he can do it twice, but he can't stack them on 1 unit.
Mhm.
And then perhaps the most powerful stratagem is the Searchlight stratagem, I believe, which is 1 CP. After you score a hit with the Searchlight unit, add 1 judgment token to that. And guess what has a Searchlight keyword? Is the Hearthkin Pioneers, which are the bikers for the Leagues of Votann. And these bikers are just, in terms of a datasheet, extremely strong. You would play them in probably every army that exists today. But in addition to that, they also enable your army to completely nuke 1 target by getting very easily up to 3 judgment tokens. Sorry. Now, Vic, you touched on what you looked in the book in terms of the Wombo combo. I know what it is, so why don't you just let our listeners know what the Wombo combo is? How did your brick of 10 Terminators compare to the Leagues of Votann?
So I've done a few test games as well, and so I played a game against my Emperor's Children. So I love Tabletop Simulator because it's very easy to set up a game against yourself and try out new armies against the army of any army you like. So I thought I'll try Leagues of Votann against Emperor's Children. I'll take some of these land fortresses. So these Hecaton land fortresses are the kind of land raider that Votann get, and they come with a type of weapon called a beam weapon. Now, the beam weapons essentially pick a target, and any unit between them and the target gets hit by the beam weapon if it hits the main target. It's kind of like Mortarian's gun. It's been there for a while, and it's never been good because it's usually been on melee units. But this is dedicated shooting unit. You can line up your beam.
And it's long range as well, which
Yeah.
makes it the best part as well. A Mortarion, I believe, is 12 inches or something, which is just really hard to line up.
So the tank has a main beam, which is a 30-inch strength 9 -3 4 damage beam. It's got 2 shots, and if you're shooting outside of 15 inches, it gives you an additional hit for each hit. So quite brutal. But it can also come with 4 little beams, so little ion beamers, which are 2 shots each, strength 7 beams. So and those are 18 inches. Now, there's a sub-faction called Ymir Conglomerate, which gives +4 inches to range, which is potentially probably the strongest sub-faction. So you're probably likely to see that one quite a lot.
Oh, in addition to that, it also gives a 4-up invulnerable save if you have a 2-up base save, which the Heckerton Land Fortress has, and your entire army gets a 5-up invulnerable save, which is the exact thing that you're missing on your entire 4-up save troop army.
Absolutely. So the wombo combo with the beams, which gets a bit wild, is Ymir Conglomerate have a stratagem for 1 CP where you pick a beam weapon. So you usually pick the main beam weapon of your Heckerton Land Fortress. And every time you score a hit, it does a mortal wound in addition. So if you, let's say, line up 2 targets on this beam, which is quite easy to do with a 30-inch beam, and you get 2 hits, it counts as 4 hits. Both of the units that get hit by the beam take 4 mortal wounds on top of the 2 4 damage hits. So quite a lot there. And then on top of that, there are 2 more struts that you can use. One is as soon as you score a hit with a beam, every time you score a hit with a beam on a 4+, that unit takes a mortal wound up to a max of 6 mortal wounds. And that applies to the rest of the shooting phase. So the rest of your army can also trigger that off with their beams. So we're currently on 10 mortal wounds, excluding the beam going through things with the Ymir stratagem. And then finally, there's another 1 CP stratagem where any ion weapons which score a unmodified 6 to wound do a mortal wound in addition. Now, the little beams on the Heckerton Land Fortress are ion beams, so they are ion weapons. And this one also maxes out at 6. Now, very importantly, with judgment tokens, anytime you trigger off your judgment token ability, so if you have 1 token on a 6+, and so on, it counts as an unmodified 6 to wound, even though it's auto wounding, because it says that in the rule.
Great.
So that's another potential 6 mortal wounds. So are we on 16 mortal wounds?
I think I've taken 16 at this point, and I haven't made a single save against your actual weapon yet, right? Which is 4 at like -4 flat 4 as well, right? Okay, cool. Just keep telling me how much more I'm taking, man. Sure, I'll roll the saves eventually.
So that's from a 250-point unit, which is extremely difficult to kill, so extreme durability. So output on single focus targets is immense. In my practice game, I had, I think it was 2 Heckerton Land Fortresses and 1 unit of their basic troops shoot at my Terminator blob, and they killed 8 out of 10, and that's fully buffed. So that's nothing else in the game can do that. So extreme.
Yeah. If you can't tell, I'm scratching my forehead right now. I mean, guys, this is an immense level of output that I don't think we've ever seen in a game before. And when Vic says the tank is strong in terms of its toughness profile, defensive profile, it's mega strong. It's toughness 8. It's got a 2-up save with AOC, so it's on an effective 1-up. It's got a 4-up invulnerable save. You can't reroll wounds against it. It's got 16 base wounds. You can top bracket it, even if it's damaged. Your Forge Master can reduce a damage that it takes to 0, so you can't even railgun it. Fantastic. Oh, by the way, the Forge Master also heals for flat 4 in the command at the end of the movement phase. So let's say you get the Land Fortress down to 4 wounds or 3 wounds. It heals back up to 7. And then they can top bracket it. And then you've got to do the whole thing time and time again. I mean, this platform is absolutely bonkers strong. And by the way, it can shoot into combat at 0 penalty because all the weapons are hunter weapons, of course. So even if you tag it in combat, which is arguably the only way to actually deal with this platform, you're certainly not going to win a shooting game unless you've got the right range profile for it. Uh,
Absolutely.
if you take it up in combat, it can shoot into combat, and it can reliably shoot into combat so well that you can shoot your beam weapon probably at a different target, use your other 4 or 5 beams to shoot whatever's in combat, and then just laugh your way to the bank. This is this is one data sheet that we've talked about. I'm going to rattle off a couple of the other data sheets that are really powerful here too.
Hmm.
So Carl, who is your kind of like reroll ones to hit warlord, gives the judgment token when he can see at the start of the command phase, and he's like 90 points or 80 points, so he's really good. Grimir is your cast 2 psychic person who also comes with 4 little drone things. No, it comes with 2 little drone things. And then your Forge Master that you upgrade comes with 4 different little drone things that it comes with, or like an armor smith and 3 other things. So you've got a 5-man little character unit, a 3-man little character unit, and by the way, guys, these like 110 points per unit, and they are insanely strong. Right, so that's your supportive attaché. You then equip whatever you have with a comms upgrade, which counts every unit as being within. If you're within 24 inches of your Carl, it counts them as being within the aura range. So as long as any unit you shoot is within 24 inches of your Carl, you get to reroll ones to hit. Fantastic. So Carl basically has a 24-inch aura of reroll ones to hit. Great. The the Hearthkin warriors they move 5. Sure, they're not the best part of the army, but they're actually deceptively durable. And because you can auto in on 4-ups, like a group of 20 shots took off 8 wounds on my Be'lakor when we played. 8
Oh,
wounds on my
beautiful.
Be'lakor when we played. This is a 110-point unit. Okay, that's not the strongest. That's probably the army that's the part of the army where you would target it if you're looking for a weakness. To back that up, you've got this incredible utility unit called the Hearthkin Pioneers, which we touched on earlier, which are the bikers. Now, these models are effectively pointed at 9 to 10 points per wound. Great. On a toughness 5 multi-wound platform that moves 12 inches, is obsec for some reason. Okay, fantastic. Has armor of
Flies.
contempt. It flies. It has mine. You can't reroll wounds against it. And by the way, it gets a scout move at the start of the game, so you can move these things 24 inches at the start of the game. And then, for some reason, they also have a 10-point upgrade, which you want to do if you're going to do it, to upgrade their weapons to heavy weapons, which for some reason gives them an amazing gun, but also gives the model that you upgrade an extra wound as well. So you're not even dropping your wounds to toughness to save ratio when you're upgrading a weapon. It's still staying at 9 to 10 points, which is a statistic that I use a lot as well. So the oh my man, this army is incredibly strong. And what I think I said in the previous episode is I was praising GW for releasing codexes that were balanced, had identity, had flavor. I think that this has gone completely out the window with this codex personally. I think that there are so many there's a limitation of data sheets in this army to begin with, and there are some data sheets that are enormously powerful. So what you're going to come to is the result that all of these lists will probably play, and here's the highline. You want to play Ymir, you want to use beams, you want 3 land fortresses, the minimum troops, the 3 characters, and bikes. Whatever combination you do after that is whatever. And people will figure this out really quick. And there's already been a bunch of lists going on online here. And that's what every game will look like. And that for me is a sad place of Warhammer in the future. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Vic? That's my rant over. I won't rant
I
anymore
mean,
about it.
I want to rant as well. I need to
Go
get
for
this
it.
out. So, I I think the problem is it's not only extreme damage output, but when you combine durability along with a points cost that is very forgiving, the whole army becomes forgiving. So, all 3 of the test games I've had, you essentially put them out in any combination of directions. Sure, there's a little bit of room for optimization in terms of how you position units, but you can almost do anything as long as you're just thinking, okay, my plan is to shoot next turn. Set up just to shoot. It doesn't matter if they're going to tag you, anything like that. Just set up so you can have some line of sight. Do that. The damage output is so incredible. You have so much more stuff than you should that you're just going to win every game except for the mirror, and
Mm.
that's horrible. That's exactly the problem we've had with some of the most broken codexes, like when Dark Technomancers was really good, when oh, maybe not Admech so much, but yeah, a little bit, and also Harlequins with their Void Weavers. Yeah, what you don't
And
want.
admittedly, Tyranids as well, who had
Absolutely.
way too much stuff on the board for how many points they could get.
It's fine for new stuff to be good. What it shouldn't be is broken.
Mm.
And I think this army is outright broken. maybe we can touch on some potential weaknesses or what the
Hmm.
community perceives as weaknesses on
Yeah.
this, Dave. Because I've been seeing a lot of comments online. I don't know what your immediate thoughts are on if there are weaknesses to this army.
Mm. So I think let's do this through the lens of the Chaos Demons game that I played against Vic's Votann.
Sure.
So, in context, I was playing my Chaos Demons list that I was playing at the time was Be'lakor, Lord of Change, 3x6 Flamers. I think I had 1x5 there. 3x10 Bloodletters, big unit of Blood Crushers, and then some Flesh Hounds and whatnot like that. Now, turn one, Vic we chat about this after the game, one like that. Vic kind of overextends his bikes. I pick them up for free. I stay basically hard tight in my deployment zone. And then turn two, I get basically the miracle turn on turn two, right? I
Yeah.
advance my Be'lakor out. I roll a 5. I can warp locus everything within 6. I've got like 5 different charges where I can wrap and gum up Vic's entire army. And I've just had my flamers come down out of Deep Strike. I've used the ability to reduce your leadership and extend the aura range for the warp storm points that I saved up from the first turn. Like it's all set to go, all guns blazing. Now, the Leagues of Votann can obviously intercept, so they can all spec scan for 2 CP with any unit. Okay, fantastic. Vic, there's nothing I can do about that, so Vic
Yep.
gets to pick that up for free. Okay, kills a unit. Then obviously they can Overwatch as well. I make all but one of my charges. Okay, great. I kill units and whatnot like that. I don't do anywhere near as much damage as I was hoping. Like I was trying to kill his Hikaton Land Fortress and whatnot like that. But after all that happened, Vic could literally just tear apart the rest of my army that was on board with, I would say, like relative ease. And he
Mhm.
did it with more or less like one land fortress and a group of 6 bikers. Now, in terms of weaknesses, what I was thinking is that the army's relatively slow and it has short-ish range. Obviously, the bikes are really fast, so that's a great compliment. So I was like, okay, what I'm going to do is stay cagey in my deployment zone until I can deep strike and warp locus everything to my Be'lakor, so that I can break those range lines really early, and Vic won't be able to shoot me and tear me apart on the first 2 turns of his turn. And I effectively got to do that. But the problem is that the army has so much redundancy is that I couldn't, despite having basically a miracle turn, I still couldn't contest Vic on the board. And like we
Mhm.
said, 10 Hearthgren Warriors dealt 8 wounds to my Be'lakor because all of a sudden getting the Judgment tokens on Be'lakor was a joke. And the common part about the army is that it doesn't matter what defensive profile you have on the wound side because you can auto win on 4 up. You just basically ignore all that. So yeah, it was just really tough. I think range is one of the parts where Votann struggle. I think probably an all-out shooting knights list is probably maybe good against Votann.
You see,
Yeah.
I think now that the boards have become smaller, I think the range bracket that Votann have on their medium-powered guns is actually pretty good. I
Mm.
mean, with the plus 4 inches of range, you're working on kind of the 22 to 34-inch range bracket on their weapons,
Hmm.
which is more than enough, to be honest. Because as much as people might say that they're slow, and yes, the base troops moving 5 and anything on foot moving 5 is slow, the fact that the bikes move 12 and they have a pre-game move immediately lets you get angles with a very high volume of shots on the bikes.
Hmm.
um, and then the land fortresses moving 10 with their guns means that if you're not too cautious and you just kind of go for it, you will get range and angles on turn 2. So what I found from my 3 games is that, like, melee armies have an approach turn into the middle of the board, Leagues of Votann have an approach turn into like the edge of their deployment zone.
Mm.
And then the next turn, anywhere the opponent goes, the movement is just about enough that you'll get angles onto everything. And that means that, in my opinion, I don't think the army is actually slow.
Yep.
It's just one turn, like it takes a turn, and
One
then
turn.
you blow your opponent up.
Yeah. One turn and then you delete about 1,000 points of your opponent's army with relative ease. And the problem being is that it's not just relative ease; it is so incredibly consistent. There is almost nothing in the army where you need to think, do I need to overcommit this way? Do I never have backup fire redundancy? Right? Because auto winning on 4 ups with rerolls, one of your tanks is even +1 to hit as well. It's ridiculous. And the army is so durable that you can actually just use your land fortresses to go onto objectives. If you go first, you can't shoot anything. I don't think there's anything wrong with just pushing your land fortresses out, getting onto objectives, and then dominating the board from a primary perspective also. And then whatever your opponent answers with, you're more than durable enough already, and then you just clean up everything after the fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a lot like what you do with bricks that bully in the middle, except this feels like the whole army does it. You go in, they kill you, but they don't kill enough to match up to the amount of damage they're taking back.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's tough, man. I'm just gonna make a prediction now. One of the things that I really dislike about this codex also is that it has a staggered model release, and off the top of your head, you might not think that's such a big deal, but this codex, guys, is so powerful that people will want to play this at tournaments, and then they will bring a fully converted army to play this at tournaments. There won't be any specific model dimensions released, so you'll have people playing models all over the show, playing, quote, Leagues of Votann, which is going to be incredibly busted. And I think the combination of those two just leaves for a lot of just feels really bad. And as a tournament competitor, someone who's potentially trying to go for rank 1, it doesn't leave me with a lot of options given how strong this codex is to not play Leagues of Votann. That's the sad reality of it too, is that it's so powerful that is it even a question of whether or not you can afford not to play it if you're trying to win and compete? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, so I played 2 games today, which was one was against Sisters, and I think in Ymir with the 4-up in, well, the multi-melters can't do enough, the combat doesn't do enough, and it's just a mess. I think you end up getting really bullied in your kind of deployment zone, and Sisters I really don't think have a game on UKTC terrain against this matchup. Now, the Chaos Space Marine game was very interesting because the last message I sent you was, guys, I've rolled it out, and all 10 of my Terminators and the Demon Prince sitting behind it have died just to like a small spattering of things shooting. I've never lost the Terminators before, but I did play the rest of the game out with all the little characters and everything, and the Noise Marines running around the edge. And actually, it's incredibly close at the end. If you can keep applying pressure to this army and you can make sure you don't get, like, normally what I do is I stick a Blastmaster out to shoot. There is no point shooting anything at the Hecaton land fortresses. Nothing like a Blastmaster. It's a premium anti-tank, but there's no point. You'll get 1 wound through, which they'll turn to 0, or they'll heal the second one up as if nothing happened. So just keep everything really deeply tucked into ruins, sitting on objectives, try and crunch them a little bit on the primary, and you can at least keep the score close. And I think if the Votann player makes a mistake, you can try and capitalize on it with melee units. That's probably the only way I can see this working. But anything which tries to engage in a shooting fight with them is going to lose. Anything that plays with fragile units is going to lose. Fast melee has a small chance until the Leagues of Votann players become more experienced and they learn how to cut those safe positions out. So it's tough.
I will also add, Psychic is a way to combat the army as well. That's a completely fair point. If I was looking at Leagues of Votann, thinking about that from a Turner perspective, if I went first and I could use the Harpies to move block the land fortresses, knowing that I would just be giving them both of them up to try and get my warriors in the mid board to then multi-charge the entire army, I could maybe win. Maybe. But I think a really good Votann player would be able to counteract things like that and just use the beams in such a smart way that it would be really tough to avoid getting hit by multi-damage. And guys, it is really hard to avoid not getting beamed because the opponent controls where their land fortress can move, obviously. And it does closest point to closest point. And, it moves 10 inches. So thinking about how you can avoid beam splash damage on top of everything you've got to do normally in the game is really taxing.
Absolutely. Well, it'll be interesting to see how it all turns out. But, I mean, my prediction is that they will absolutely dominate the meta. And they'll probably people will try and shift to try and counter it. But I don't think there's a good enough counter available with what we have at the moment. So yeah, it could be the whole meta catching on fire kind of situation here.
Yeah, it's tough. Let's segue that into, I touched on it a little bit before, but Chaos Demons. Last week I made a couple of statements that the Be'lakor I wasn't sold on. I flip-flopped on that one. and we're allowed to flip-flop. I was wrong. Be'lakor is quite good. He's deceptively tanky as well from shooting, which is great. And then he gives you access to all the Warpstorm powers, and then he also has a Locust keyword. So he is a really big enabler of your army. His Chapter Master reroll Warlord trait is like not even that good. I most of the lists I've created, I haven't even taken it. But the lists, what I wasn't so impressed with was actually the Lord of Change, because sometimes his output, the Lord of Change, is just not that great, and I love a good psychic caster, and I love him because he's dynamic and move around, and then psychic, and then infernal, gateway, 3D, plus 3 inches mortal wounds, and then on 2 you take mortal wounds. The problem is that the reliability just isn't there. So kind of what I've landed on is Be'lakor in a Supreme Detachment, and then a mixed battalion of Khorne, I think. And I've basically taken 2 psychic casters, like 2, I believe they're called change casters, like the 80-point Zinch ones that cast 2, that move 6 inches. And then I've taken a Khorne little beatstick character, that 80-point skull taker, I think. And then I've taken 5 units of Bloodthirsters. And then I've followed that up with
It's bloodletters, right? Not bloodthirst.
Yeah,
No
5 units
problem.
of 10.
5 bloodthirsts would be terrifying.
Yeah, that'd be quite good. Yeah, so like 50 bloodletters, and then I've also taken some flesh hounds because I think they're a good value, and then 3 units of 6 flamers. Like, of course, why would you not take that? And the way that I think you really need to use the army is have a little fast character or fast moving platform that can get within aura range or into turn 2 into your opponent's army. Use the Warpstorm powers so that you're minusing their leadership even further. Dropping your bloodletters down either within 6 inches of your Be'lakor, that hopefully you can get to the middle of the board on turn 2 if he's not dead. And then really skirmish around the outsides of the entire board. And also try and use the, I think it's called Wreath Shadows, which allows you to teleport your Flamer squads and deep strike them. That's the real dynamic power of the army. The issue fundamentally is that demons are really easy to pick up after the turn they come down. And Vix Votann, like we talked about, basically pick them all up with absolutely zero problems. The thing that I would try and avoid is, and this is the mistake that I made, is don't get your flamers into combat ever. Because actually picking them out sometimes, even with the psychic power, is not reliable at all. Like I wrapped Vic's Hecaton Fortress, and then I just gummed myself up in combat, and I couldn't realistically fall back and still shoot. So just, I think, play the flames at range. Even if you come down, flame something, and then your opponent can shoot them back, just don't worry about it, because you're going to be taking 3-up saves anyway, and then you'll be able to move and shoot them the next turn as well. So yeah, that's my little spiel on Chaos Demons. I think they're actually probably a minus army at the moment. Maybe you do have the advantage of your opponent probably not really knowing what's going on, which is it's a real advantage. But fundamentally, the data sheets are not incredibly powerful, and it's actually the output is quite good. The output's good, I would say. It's just that the durability is really lacking there. What were your thoughts on the demons?
I mean, I think it's an army without shooting. That's immediately a negative for me. I always think that they come with weaknesses like that. It's also an army that primarily deep strikes. That's both a strength and a weakness. And you have to wait a turn to do most of your stuff, and then when you do come in, especially if your opponent went first, they have a lot of ability to screen. Now things have changed. There's no longer any stranglehold. Engagement isn't as good anymore, so people aren't bringing those little one-man units to go and screen and do things so much unless they have a secondary specifically made for it, like Iron Hands or something. So I think an army like Demons is well positioned in the meta to disrupt things a little bit. I think they come with too many weaknesses and too high a general point cost relative to the output and durability of the army to truly compete to win events consistently. I would probably not put them in that top kind of 7 or 8 factions, but I know a lot of other content producers are thinking they're absolutely incredible, so I could be a bit wrong with that.
Yeah, maybe no, I'm not going to play Demons. I mean, if Tyranids get nerfed, I will play Demons. That's for sure. But yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe now's the time we'll go on and answer a couple of viewer questions. So I know we had
Sure.
one about Eldari. What are your kind of thoughts about Eldari at the moment, Vic? I'm not going to talk about this because I have no clue, guys. Kind of what are the meta lists and what would you take if you were forced to play Eldari to LGT?
So I love Eldar, and as soon as the Eldar Codex came out and that Hail of Doom list, I went straight for it. I like took it to an event almost immediately, and people, for some reason, I got a reputation as the like a one of like the main Hail of Doom players. I like that. I enjoyed that, um, and I loved the way the army worked, but I think a little bit excessively Eldar took many, many nerfs in the last data balanced data slate,
Mhm.
and when it immediately came out, people felt like Eldar got off very lightly. Hail of Doom became all-consuming, so you couldn't take a second trait with it. And then a number of units got small points upgrades across the board, and people saw that and they said, "Okay, just run the same Hail of Doom list, no problem, it'll be fine." And then they looked at Harlequins, where Dark got extremely heavily nerfed, and their luck dice got very heavily nerfed as well. And they said, "Well, look, Harlequins are going to be rubbish now. Job done." Eldar's still good. Harlequins got a massive nerf.
Hmm.
And as soon as I read that, I thought exactly the opposite. I think Harlequins have got off with this completely fine, and Eldar have been nerfed very severely because the nerfs around the game and the way the missions are played hit Eldar very hard. Losing to the last was one of the key secondary objectives that Eldar were using before, and Stranglehold was extremely useful as well. They also made engage a little bit harder, which makes it quite tricky in the middle of the game. So you end up with an army that does less damage overall, and has less units on the board because everything's more expensive, has a much worse secondary game because now you have to be active rather than passive. And you end up with an army which is considerably weaker than it was before, to the point where I personally feel it doesn't truly compete at the top levels. And I think the results from things like WTC and stuff show that Eldar were not doing too well there. And I think it's only going to be worse now when we see their results in UKTC, as armies have to switch away from running so many swooping hawks now that they maybe don't have ignore cover on them, or you're dropping Hail of Doom. So the overall output is just too low relative to the durability of the army. And I think their win rate will just start plummeting. And it has been plummeting. They're
Hmm.
winning way less events. Their win rate is way down. And I think people are understanding now that Craftwell Eldar are maybe not one of the strongest factions anymore.
Hmm.
Saying that, there have been a few good results with them. The second place at Nova was an Altway list, and there's been a few little Altway lists here and there which have been doing well.
What
Uh,
does that do, by the way? Because I see that second place Altway and I think like what is going on here? You know?
I can't explain it. Nova was open boards.
Hmm.
He had 3 Falcons,
Okay.
and I think he was essentially just playing the mission, quite
Hmm.
aggressively trying to play the mission and throwing away his units. It's worked out. I'm guessing he's probably quite a skilled player. I've seen his name before in places, so he could have just outskilled his opponents
Hmm.
to success, which amazing for him. But and I think still a lot of top players and really experienced players can take the tools that Craftwall Eldar have to some level of success. But I feel like it will always be an uphill battle against some of the better armies in the meta.
For
So
sure.
that's
I think that exactly actually that second place result it kind of exemplifies also the big advantage you have if your opponents aren't getting reps in against the army you're playing.
yeah,
And that can have a really big impact on it as well, which is a serious consideration when you're thinking about what army you're going to bring to a tournament for sure.
absolutely. Well, I think what could possibly run now, I think if you go pure Craft World Eldar, I personally like running Ignore Cover as one of the traits and still leaning into Swooping Hawks. Maybe now, because without To the Last, you don't need to lean into 10-man units, and actually the 6-man units of Swooping Hawks are excellent. Um, and for a second trait, you have quite a few different options. You can improve your psychic ability with Children of Prophecy. You can go for Exploding Sixes in combat with Vengeful. You could also go the kind of Team Australia WTC style with Swift Strike, so you can advance and still battle focus, which is also strong. But I think ignore cover plus something else for an outputty kind of Eldar list. And then if you want to actually have a bit more success, I think Yanari give tools to allow you to play the melee side with a lot of tricks quite nicely, because
Mm.
being able to include Harlequin troops and give them a number of different buffs so that their output goes extremely high is actually a very useful tool for Eldar. Um, so I think that combined with the spiky damage of the Yinkan lets you play a really fun, aggressive game where you're trying to outskill and out trade your opponent, which is it's really cool, and I'm really glad people have been doing well with it. That's definitely one that I would love to get onto the board, but I'm just enjoying the Emperor's Children too much at the moment.
And rightfully so, taking that cheeky 5-0 at the GTF you missed part 2. There you go. The last few question we had that we thought we'd tackle is preparing for a major event, preparing for a tournament. We're probably, I want to say, a week and a half out from list submissions, maybe 2 weeks out from the LGT. LGT being in the beginning of October. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to talk about how I'm thinking about the event and what I'm thinking about submitting. At the moment, I'm primarily trying to observe the meta and predict where it's going to go. And my impressions so far on UKTC have been that the output of lists has dramatically increased, particularly at shooting. Now, there was a list at the Invitational I probably didn't really want to play, and it's been moved into one of the more coin flippy ones. Is that Kyle Grundy's Riptide Sunshark Bombers list? You can check it out on the stream for Warhammer tournaments if you want to check it out too. We didn't end up playing, but that's a really good example of a list that has just gone full output, right? Like, okay, I understand that my secondaries are not great. I'm just going to try and table you and bully you off the board. That, believe it or not, is actually those are lists that Tyranid, Leviathan warriors don't actually fare so well into.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, we've got knights, and I think the knight lists are gravitating more towards the 4+, 5+ autocannon Halverin shooters, which is, I mean, once again, that's worrying because at the end of the day, I'm still trying to make it across the board and trying to get into combat, so that's worrying. And then Necrons, they have the One Destroyer unit that has quite a lot of output as well. So those are the big boogeymen. Harlequins is kind of an auto win matchup, so I'm not too worried about that, thankfully. Harlequins don't do great into warriors, but so it's led me thinking a lot about the elements in my list that I am finding a little bit lackluster, and for that, I'm finding it is the Harpies actually. Now, Harpies have been fantastic for me across basically all of the success I've had, even with Leviathan Crusher Stampede at Las Vegas. So I'm pretty hesitant to maybe think about taking them out the list. But in many of the games where I feel like I could potentially lose, the Harpy was a little bit of a letdown. Versus Knights with the autocannon spams, the Harpies basically start the game in outflank, which reduces my CP. And then against things like Tau, where it's Hammerhead, Long Strike, Riptides, Sunstrike Bombers, they have to go back into outflank again, and they don't have that tremendous impact when they hit the board, especially if you're playing Stranglethorn cannons. Now, where they do really shine is that versus armies like Drakari and Eldari, they are, they're incredible guys. Like, they can almost win the game by themselves. They have so many shots, you can shoot all their units, and it's just, it's a field day. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. But those matchups, I'm thinking maybe I can just win anyway without the Harpy. And so, maybe thinking about that 350 points of Harpies that I have, what can I flex that into? And I've been thinking sort of around, and the Tyranid Prime. My interpretation of the Tyranid Prime after the event is that I wouldn't play it at 80 points. I found that whilst the Imperative was good, I was having to use the cast to put it on a unit, which isn't great. And then the character itself wasn't amazing at 80 points. Like, it didn't do wonders for me. Admittedly, I could have played it better, but I just found it hard to activate, and I kind of found that it sat at the back of not at the back of the board, but in the mid board, and didn't really hit home in a lot of ways. So I think I would drop the 2 Harpies, which would free me up with 430 points. Now, what I do think is reasonably good against Necrons, la-di-da-di-da, is maybe the old Carnifexes,
Oh, yeah.
They have the inbuilt -1 damage, which against destroyers is, that's pretty good. You can give one of them light cover, which is also nice because it's on a base 1-up save there. And then actually their melee output is quite good. So you get a relevant, if you're going to go with the Carnifex with the Heavy Venom Cannon, you get a relevant shooting platform that can also activate into melee. Those are the two things you want versus Necrons, because you want things that just have raw output. And then against Knights, that's great. You've got a Heavy Venom platform that's going to be -1 hit from your Venom Throats on effective 2-up or 1-up save. That's great. And then also the Stone Crusher cannon. No, sorry, that's the Screamer Killer. How can I forget him? With his big 11 attacks. The Screamer Killer is pretty good against Necrons too. -1 damage is actually really sick against Wraiths. And actually, -1 damage in the meta, just thinking about it right
It's
now,
pretty solid.
is pretty good, right? Because against Necrons, -1 damage is really good if more of them play Wraiths. And then against Knights, -1 damage is, that's perfectly great. Against autocannons, it's good, and then you're saving your autocannons on 4-ups, and they're wounding it. They're hitting on -1 hit for your Venom Throats too. So, look, man, maybe I just cut the Harpies a little bit and play a couple of Carnifexes. I think, they do take a lot more. You lose the bomb as well, which is tough, but you do gain a raw output platform that is less of a lenient against some of these armies that you need to outflank your Harpies against. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. I think the meta is getting even more killy at ranged, which is a scary thought for Tyranids as well. Yeah. What are your impressions?
So I can see me included, just looking at my box full of sisters as soon as you said you're dropping the Harpies and being like, oh, maybe there's a chance now. Maybe I've got a chance. Because just to be clear, Dave has been smashing me with those Harpies while I was playing Eldar, sisters, and now all of a sudden I switched to Chaos Space Marines and they're thinking of disappearing. A bit suspicious.
Duck and weave.
So here's me when I submit the sisters, and the Harpies will still be there ruining my life. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good observation there. And the Harpies can be a liability as people build in the long range shooting to kill things like Sun Shark bombers and Harpies. So it's interesting because when you put them into strategic reserve, they become a very different tool to them starting on the board. And people also are moving away from armies like Eldar and Sisters, which are very vulnerable to the Harpies, and moving a lot more to units that sit in cover, maybe with Armor of Contempt. And it's a really interesting observation. So I think obviously we're gonna wait until list submission before we say exactly what we've submitted, but in terms of ideas, yeah, that's a really good thing to think about where the meta is going to go.
I feel like you would submit Emperor's Children at this point. I think just between us, I think you're sold. I can see that you're smiling when you're playing them. You're having a really good time with them.
It's just really fun.
It's a powerful list as well, and I think it also has a big advantage of it's not going to be on people's radar as well. I'm not going to lie, but if I had the models, I would potentially even go for them as well.
The thing which I love is this moment where it's a slow army. The army, everything moves. It's slower than Leagues of Votann. Okay, right? It's slower than squads. And when you get this setup where you end your turn and you look at your opponent and they're thinking, okay, right, let me plan my turn. He's got loads of stuff which I can do. He thinks he's got loads of stuff which he can do, but all of a sudden he realizes he can't go onto any objective. The threat range is too much, so we can't move forward. All the firing angles are covered. And that satisfaction when your opponent's just like, oh no, I've got nothing I can do here. That's what I love about Emperor's Children. Just pain and suffering.
We're going to have to get some practice games in. Emperor's Children versus Screamer Killer Carnifex.
Yeah.
Playtest game 15 or something like that.
But saying that, I might realistically have a little test around with Creations of Bile, and especially if they don't get hit by a nerf before LGT, but because I think there's potential that we might get a balanced data slate very shortly.
Yep.
And I'm expecting Creations of Bile to go the way of Dark Harlequins. If they do, do you not think so?
I don't think Creations of Bile are going to be on the radar. I think it's only going to be, if they're going to do something, it'll only be Necrons and Tyranids, personally. Maybe Knights, a little bit.
Interesting, because I think Creations of Bile has had a little bit of community noise about it.
Mm.
It's been winning a number of events. It's probably the most successful Legion, and a lot of people are saying like, "Oh yeah, if you have a melee army, you just immediately lose to this
Yep.
Creations of Bile army." So that kind of feels bad is probably something the Games Workshop do want to try and correct. Whether or not they nerf it as hard as Dark, I'm not sure if they'll go in that hard. But hopefully it's measured and appropriate.
Measured and appropriate. That's what we would like to see from Games Workshop, and I think that's a great note to end on with the Leagues of Brokann. Measured and appropriate, Games Workshop. That's what we would like to see the FAQ errata to be, to put Leagues of Votann back in its place on day one of the release.
Legends, straight into Legends.
Straight into Legends. It's an only Crusade army. There you go, Fangs. That's it for today's episode, guys. We hope you've had a great time listening, and we really appreciate all the new people that have come in to listen to episode 2 of the 40K Fireside podcast. And if you're a returning listener from episode 1, welcome again. We hope you guys had a great time listening, and once again, any feedback that you've got is greatly appreciated. I've been David.
All right, and I'm Vic. Take care, guys.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to the 40K Fireside podcast. Vic and I hope you've enjoyed listening, and we greatly appreciate any feedback that you can provide after the show.